Culture shock is a familiar idea to many, but there's some confusion about what it actually means. There are two words that are really important for understanding what culture shock is all about: cumulative disorientation. Let's talk about what that means. Sometimes it's helpful to think of culture like a map. When you are in your own culture, you learn how the map works. You learn how different things work together and how to navigate around your social and physical environments. For example, you know how to find a grocery store. You know how to relate with friends. And you have a sense of what's expected by others, such as your boss. You even know how to navigate parts of the map you might not like to be in, like conflict. When you are in an unfamiliar culture, something interesting happens. There are often elements that look really similar to what you're used to in your own culture: grocery stores, friends, bosses, even conflict. And then there are new things that you haven't seen before on your map. For example, maybe you're from a culture that rarely has fresh baked bread, and you find yourself in a land filled with bakeries. Or maybe you're used to driving everywhere, and now you're in a place where you can get around on public transit and don't have or need a car. At first, all of these changes can be really exciting. The discovery of familiar things in unfamiliar arrangements, the discovery of new and different ways of doing life, all of this can be really fun and invigorating. Believe it or not, this is actually the first stage that many people experience in culture shock. This emotional high is not experienced by everyone who crosses cultures, but it is experienced by many. While the amount of time that this lasts can vary, it is often at least as long as most short vacations and service trips. For example, someone on a 2-week trip might never leave this stage. Sometimes called the honeymoon stage, it can leave us with unrealistic interpretations of what we actually encountered. However, eventually the shine begins to wear off, and the differences between our map of how the world works and our host culture's map of how the world works start to wear us down. One of the reasons that it can be discouraging in this stage is that we often start to become aware of how much we don't really understand. For example, if you get sick, you might realize that your familiar ways of taking care of yourself aren't available. Sometimes cultural understandings of illness make this even more confusing, such as when the kinds of food that you might eat to help yourself feel better are considered unhelpful by people from your host culture. Or if one of the ways that you like to relax is to go on a drive, but you are living in a context where it doesn't make sense to have your own car, you might realize that you don't know how to relax here. Sometimes even the things that were exciting at first become frustrating. Remember all of those bakeries? If you're used to having food with a long shelf life and find that fresh bakery bread doesn't last as long as your old supermarket bread, you might have to come up with new patterns of shopping. And you might discover that familiar ingredients for cooking aren't available, or even that you aren't sure how to navigate the temperatures and measurement sizes when you cook. Even something as small as where to find familiar characters on a computer keyboard can be off. Each of these situations might be small and insignificant in itself, but each one adds a small layer of disorientation, where you might have thought you knew how to do things in your new cultural context, but find out that your map for how the world works just isn't quite right here. One of the most disorienting experiences related to all of these disorientations is when you try to make your old map fit in your new location. Sometimes they're really familiar looking landmarks. This can lead to a moment of relief, feeling like, okay, I've got it figured out. But the different landmarks don't fit together in the new culture the way they do in your old map, which means that if you keep trying to use your old map, you'll have to keep turning it and turning it and turning it, and it will never come out just right. Each of these moments of disorientation has an impact which itself might be small. Some are very disruptive. Some are hardly noticeable. Imagine them like drops and cups of water being added to a bucket. We deal with little things like this all the time, and eventually we get them processed and they leave the bucket. But when crossing cultures, there are just so many, and some of them are rather large, and they overwhelm our capacity to process. This leads to a condition of discouragement that can be really significant and which can last multiple months. Unfortunately, this often happens just as we and others expect ourselves to be hitting our stride and performing well in the new context. This can all lead to a pretty uncomfortable situation, and coping well is really important. There's more on that in our transitions process video. Slowly, it becomes possible to start working your way back toward a more normal sense of well-being. But this stage of culture shock is slow, and often runs in fits and starts. Sometimes you'll develop new skills, and then the next day find that there are even more skills to learn than you'd realized. But slowly, gradually, you start to climb your way back up through a process of consciously building your competence. Again, this can last for multiple months, and for a long-term transition, can actually go on for more than a year. Eventually, you return back to a sense of normal that is more like what you were used to before. Of course, now you are using a new map, one that's largely borrowed from your new cultural context. From time to time, you'll realize there are still gaps to fill in, but it usually isn't as disruptive as it was before. Okay, so in summary, there are 4 main stages of culture shock: the honeymoon stage, disenchantment, recovery, and the new normal. These are brought about by wrestling with cumulative disorientation that happens when how we think the world works doesn't match how the world actually works in our new cultural context. And we slowly recover our ability to interact with the world from what feels like a normal sense of well-being. Sometimes people will talk about experiencing a culture shock, but this usually happens when they are referring to a culturally stressful incident and not to the type of culture shock model we're talking about here. We recommend keeping these ideas distinct. But there's one more thing to know. Most people who end up returning back to their original culture experience culture shock again. We call it re-entry shock. This happens because while gone, both you and your home culture have changed, and your map no longer works quite right at home either. It's important to be aware that this can happen. You can learn more about re-entry in the Transitions Across Cultures book. Even though culture shock and re-entry shock can be very disruptive, they are short-term events and are usually completely resolved after 6 months to 2 years. As long as you cope well and seek appropriate support, the culture shock part of your journey will be well worth the joys of finding your new way of being you in the world.